My father, he wanted me for breeding." The rancher froze. Then did something horrifying. The sun rose slowly over the wide, dusty fields of the old ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Birds began to chirp, and the faint sound of cattle lowing echoed across the open land. The ranch had been in the family for generations, and every corner seemed to hold memories of laughter, hard work, and sometimes silent tension. Among these fields and barns lived Daniel, a young man in his early 20s, whose life had been shaped by the weight of his father's expectations. Daniel's father, George, was a man whose presence was as large as the ranch itself. His hands were rough from years of labor, and his voice carried the kind of authority that made people obey without question. He had built the ranch from scratch, turning a stretch of barren land into a thriving farm. Everyone admired him in the town. He was known as a man of discipline, someone who never tolerated laziness, and whose word was law. But at home, Daniel felt a different kind of pressure, one that was suffocating at times. George wanted his son to be strong, capable, and resilient, but his ways of showing care were strict, bordering on harsh. He believed that life had no place for weakness, and he often reminded Daniel that he had to toughen up if he wanted to survive in the world. Daniel had grown up knowing that mistakes were not tolerated. Every action he took on the ranch was scrutinized, from how he fed the horses to the way he repaired fences. If a gate was left open or a tool misplaced, George would frown, shake his head, and lecture him for hours. Daniel respected his father, but he often felt invisible under that mountain of expectations. His dreams, his feelings, even his small victories, seemed to vanish in the shadow of his father's towering presence. He longed for moments of genuine praise, a simple smile or nod, but they were rare and fleeting. Instead, he found himself walking on eggshells, constantly trying to guess what would please his father. Despite the tension, Daniel loved the ranch. He loved the smell of hay in the morning, the cool touch of river water on a hot day, and the soft sound of the cattle moving through the pastures. He loved the rhythm of life here, where work began before sunrise and ended long after sunset. The land taught him patience, and the animals taught him responsibility. But even with all this, he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard he worked, it would never be enough for George. This unspoken expectation weighed heavily on him, like a shadow that followed him from room to room, from field to field. One morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. He could hear the wind rustling through the tall grasses, carrying the scent of fresh earth. Today, he thought, would be different. Today, he wanted to prove something, not just to his father, but to himself. He dressed quickly, putting on his worn boots and a faded shirt, and headed toward the barn. The morning was crisp, and the sun's first rays reflected off the dew-covered grass. The horses whinnied softly as he approached, and he smiled, feeling a rare sense of calm. There was peace here, even in a life full of challenges. Daniel's father, George, was already in the barn inspecting the livestock. He moved with precision, checking the animals one by one, making notes in his worn leather notebook. Daniel watched silently, taking in every gesture, every movement. He had learned a lot from watching his father work: how to handle the animals, how to read the weather, how to manage the land. Yet for all his knowledge, he felt like he was constantly being tested, as if nothing he did could ever fully satisfy George. The tension was like a rope stretched tight between them, ready to snap at any moment. "Morning, Dad," Daniel said cautiously, his voice breaking the silence. George glanced up, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Morning. Let's get to work," he replied, his tone firm but not unkind. Daniel knew better than to expect more words than necessary. The morning passed in a blur of activity, feeding the animals, repairing fences, moving hay bales. Sweat dripped down Daniel's forehead and his muscles ached, but he didn't complain. He wanted to show his father that he could handle the work, that he was capable of more than George might have thought. By midday, the sun was high, and the ranch felt alive with the sounds of labor and nature. Daniel wiped his brow and took a deep breath, glancing at his father. George was inspecting the new irrigation system, his hands moving skillfully, his eyes focused. Daniel admired the precision and dedication his father had. but he also felt a pang of sadness. He wished there was a way to bridge the gap between them. To be seen not just as a worker on the ranch, but as a son who had feelings, dreams, and aspirations of his own. He longed for a moment of connection, a small acknowledgement that he mattered beyond the work he did. As the afternoon wore on, George finally spoke. "Daniel, we need to talk," he said, his voice carrying the kind of weight that made Daniel's stomach tighten. They walked toward the porch, where the warm light of the sun bathed the wooden structure in gold. Daniel could feel his heart racing. He wasn't sure if this was going to be a lecture, a test, or something else entirely. He simply nodded, trying to steady himself. George looked at him, his expression unreadable. "You're strong, Daniel. You've learned a lot, and I see that. But there's more to running this ranch than just working hard. You need to understand responsibility." Draven Glane kneels on the execution stand with his head. "You need to understand how to make decisions, how to think ahead, how to protect what we've built." His voice softened slightly, though it still carried authority. "I want you to be ready for the day when this ranch is yours. That day will come, but you need to be prepared." Daniel listened carefully, hanging on to every word. It was the first time in a long while that George had spoken to him like this. Not as a worker, but as someone who mattered, someone with potential. Daniel felt a mixture of pride and nervousness. The responsibility George spoke of was enormous, but it was also a chance to prove himself, to step out of his father's shadow and into his own life. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The ranch demanded hard work, careful planning, and unwavering dedication. But for the first time, Daniel felt like his efforts might truly matter. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields. Daniel and his father walked back to the barn, the day's work behind them. The air was filled with the scent of hay, horses, and the faint smoke from the fireplace inside the house. Daniel felt a strange combination of exhaustion and exhilaration. The tension that had always existed between him and his father hadn't vanished completely, but for the first time, it seemed manageable. There was a sense of understanding, however small, that made him believe things could change. That evening, as Daniel sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from gold to deep purple, he thought about the future. He thought about the ranch, the animals, and the land that had been in his family for generations. He thought about his father's expectations and about his own dreams. For the first time, he didn't feel trapped by them. He felt challenged, yes, but also motivated. He realized that the path ahead would be difficult, full of hard work and tough decisions, but it was also full of possibilities, and for the first time, he felt ready to face them. Night fell over the ranch, and the stars began to twinkle in the clear sky. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of a new day. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds and smells of the ranch fill him with a sense of calm. He knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more work, and more lessons. But he also knew that he was not alone. He had his father, flawed and strict though he was, guiding him in his own way. And he had himself, his courage, his determination, and his willingness to grow. Together, they would face whatever came next, and the ranch would continue to thrive, a testament to hard work, resilience, and the unspoken bond between father and son. The next morning, Daniel woke up to the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the wooden slats of his bedroom window. The ranch was quiet, save for the distant lowing of cows and the rustle of leaves in the wind. He stretched, feeling the lingering soreness from the previous day's hard work, and took a deep breath. Today, he decided, he would focus not only on doing the work, but on learning something new, something that might impress his father and show him that he was capable of more than he had believed. Daniel had always been curious about the older parts of the ranch, the barns that had been built decades ago, the storage sheds that creaked with age, and the old well that no longer drew water, but still held a quiet, mysterious charm. These places fascinated him because they carried history. Each wooden beam and rusted nail seemed to whisper stories of the generations who had lived and worked here before him. He loved imagining what life had been like for his father as a boy, running across the same fields, climbing the same trees, and learning the lessons of survival and responsibility. After a quick breakfast of eggs and toast, Daniel grabbed his gloves, a hammer, and a notebook. then headed out to inspect the older barns. He wanted to assess their condition and perhaps make some improvements. He had noticed last week that one of the barn doors had a loose hinge, and it had started to squeak loudly whenever it moved. He decided to fix it properly today, hoping that his father would notice and approve of his careful work. As Daniel worked on the door, he reflected on his life on the ranch. He loved the rhythm of the work, the repetition, the way each day brought new challenges, yet demanded consistency. But he also felt the quiet loneliness that sometimes came with it. George, though strict and often unyielding, was not a man who shared his feelings easily. Conversations between father and son were often practical and short, centered on chores, animals, or repairs. Daniel wished for more. He wished for moments of understanding, of shared stories, of encouragement. He wanted his father to see him not just as a worker, but as a person with his own thoughts, feelings, and dreams. By late morning, the barn door was fixed. Daniel stood back, wiped the sweat from his brow, and felt a surge of pride. The door moved smoothly now, without a single squeak. He made a note in his notebook, detailing what he had done and what materials he had used. It was a small thing perhaps, but it felt like a step forward, a sign that he was capable of taking responsibility and seeing a task through to the end. As he worked, he noticed movement in the distance. One of the younger ranch hands was leading a few cows toward the pasture, and the sunlight glinted off the metal of the fence posts. Daniel's attention was drawn to a part of the land that he had rarely explored. It was a small grove of trees near the river, where the grass grew thick and the shade was cool. He decided to take a break and walk over there, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The grove was quiet, except for the sound of the river flowing gently nearby. Daniel sat on a fallen log and let the breeze cool his face. He could hear the distant sounds of the ranch, the clatter of tools, the lowing of cattle, the faint creak of the old barn doors. Yet here, in the shade of the trees, it felt like another world entirely. For a few moments he let himself relax, closing his eyes and listening to the soft murmur of the water. It was a peaceful reprieve from the constant pressure he felt under his father's gaze. But peace on the ranch was often fleeting. Soon Daniel heard the familiar, authoritative voice of George calling out from the fields. "Daniel! Come here!" The tone was not angry, but it carried weight, demanding attention. Daniel stood, brushing the dirt from his pants, and hurried toward his father. As he approached, he saw George standing near the new irrigation system, examining the flow of water with careful attention. "Good morning, Dad," Daniel said, trying to sound calm and confident. "Morning," George replied, not looking up. "I need your help with something important today. We have to prepare the fields for planting next month, and I want you to take the lead on organizing the irrigation lines." Daniel felt a surge of nervousness mixed with excitement. This was more responsibility than he had handled before, but he also knew it was a chance to prove himself. He nodded and followed his father's instructions carefully, taking detailed notes on where the line should go and how the water should be directed. George watched him closely, occasionally offering tips or corrections. Daniel listened attentively, doing his best to absorb every detail. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. Daniel moved tirelessly, digging, adjusting pipes, and making sure each line was properly secured. His arms ached. His hands were blistered, but he felt a sense of accomplishment that made the fatigue worthwhile. George, too, seemed satisfied. He nodded occasionally, acknowledging Daniel's efforts with a brief word of praise. Though it was minimal, it felt significant. Daniel realized that these small moments of recognition were as meaningful as any grand gesture. As they worked side by side, Daniel found himself thinking about the lessons his father had taught him over the years. George had always emphasized the importance of planning, of thinking ahead, and of taking responsibility for one's actions. Daniel had sometimes resented these lessons, feeling that they were harsh or overly demanding. But now, as he applied them in real life, he understood their value. The ranch was a living system, delicate and interconnected, and every decision had consequences. Learning to anticipate problems, to prepare for challenges, and to act decisively was not just about survival. It was about stewardship, about honoring the legacy of the land and the family who had nurtured it for generations. By late afternoon, the irrigation lines were properly arranged, and the fields were ready for planting. Daniel and George stood back, surveying their work. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. Daniel felt a swell of pride and relief. He had completed the task successfully, and more importantly, he had earned a moment of approval from his father. George looked at him, his eyes meeting Daniel's for the first time that day. "You did good work today," he said simply. Daniel felt a rush of warmth at the words. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough to make him feel seen and appreciated. He realized that his father's way of showing care was not through affection or words, but through recognition of effort and competence, and in its own way, it was meaningful. As evening approached, Daniel helped his father tend to the animals, feeding the cows, checking on the horses, and making sure the fences were secure. The day had been long and exhausting, but there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the ranch was in order. The work was hard, yes, but it was honest and purposeful, and Daniel felt a growing sense of confidence in his abilities, a realization that he could handle responsibility and rise to challenges if he remained focused and determined. Later, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset, Daniel reflected on the day. He thought about the lessons he had learned, the skills he had honed, and the small but meaningful moments of connection with his father. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of partnership with George, a recognition that they were working toward the same goal, each in their own way contributing to the ranch's future. The sky turned a deep shade of purple, and the stars began to appear one by one. The ranch, bathed in the soft glow of evening, seemed almost magical. Daniel felt a quiet contentment, knowing that he had done well and that his efforts had been noticed. He understood that the path ahead would not always be easy, but he also knew that he had the skills, determination, and guidance to face whatever challenges might come. As night fell, the ranch grew still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the gentle sound of animals settling for the night. Daniel went inside, washed up, and sat by the fireplace, thinking about the future. He knew that there would be more challenges, more hard work, and more lessons to learn. But he also knew that he was growing stronger, more capable, and more confident in his own abilities. And with each passing day, he felt a little closer to bridging the gap with his father, building a relationship based on respect, understanding, and shared purpose. The night stretched on, and Daniel finally went to bed, feeling a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new challenges, and new opportunities to learn and grow. But he felt ready, equipped not only with practical skills but with the determination and mindset to face whatever came next. And as he drifted off to sleep, the ranch seemed to hold a quiet promise, a promise that hard work, patience, and perseverance would eventually lead to success, understanding, and perhaps even a deeper bond between father and son. The next morning, Daniel woke before dawn, the first light of day just beginning to touch the horizon. The ranch was quiet, still wrapped in the soft folds of night, and the cool air carried the scent of dew-soaked grass and earth. Daniel felt a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness as he got dressed. Today was different. Today his father had asked him to handle a task almost entirely on his own. George's trust, implicit but rare, weighed on Daniel's shoulders. He felt the weight of responsibility and a strange thrill. Finally, he could test his own abilities, make decisions, and see the results without constant correction. Breakfast was quiet, as usual. George sat across from him, reading a worn notebook filled with numbers, schedules, and reminders. Daniel could feel his father's eyes on him, sharp and measuring, though there were no words. He poured himself some coffee, took a bite of toast, and tried to calm his racing thoughts. He knew that today could be a turning point, a chance to show that he was capable not just of hard labor, but of thoughtful, careful judgment. After the meal, George spoke. "Daniel, I want you to check the north pasture today. There's been a problem with the water line, and I want to see if you can figure out what's wrong and fix it." His voice was firm but calm, as though he expected the work to be done efficiently and thoroughly. Daniel nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This task required not just physical effort but observation, analysis, and planning. It was a challenge that would test everything he had learned so far. Daniel grabbed his tools, a wrench, a notebook, and a small toolbox, and headed toward the north pasture. The sun was just beginning to rise higher, casting long shadows across the fields. The cows were already moving slowly, grazing on the fresh grass, while the horses flicked their tails and stomped at the earth. The sounds of life on the ranch were comforting, a steady reminder that despite challenges and tension, life here moved with a reliable rhythm. As Daniel examined the waterline, he realized the problem was more complex than he had expected. A section of pipe was cracked, and the flow of water had been irregular for weeks, causing frustration for the livestock and complicating daily chores. Daniel knelt by the pipe, tracing its path with careful fingers, checking connections and noting every irregularity. It required patience and concentration, qualities he had been cultivating for years but had rarely been tested in a situation like this. He spent hours working on the pipe, replacing a damaged section, tightening connections, and testing the flow. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his hands were covered in dirt and grime, but he persisted. Each time he thought he had solved the problem, he tested it again, adjusting, observing, and refining. There was a rhythm to the work, a flow that he found oddly satisfying. It wasn't just about fixing the pipe, it was about thinking critically, being patient, and seeing a task through to its conclusion. Around midday, Daniel heard the familiar sound of his father's boots crunching against the gravel path. George was walking toward him, not speaking, just observing. Daniel felt a wave of nervous energy. Would his father notice the work? Would he approve? He tried to remain calm, focusing on the task at hand, but he couldn't help stealing glances at George's expression, hoping for even a small sign of acknowledgement. George approached slowly, looking over the pipe and the surrounding area. He nodded once, barely perceptible, but it carried weight. "Not bad," he said finally. "You've done a good job. The water is flowing properly now and everything looks secure." Daniel felt a surge of relief and pride. Praise from his father was rare and often understated, but it meant more to him than he could fully express. For the first time, he felt that his efforts were recognized, not just as labor, but as thoughtful, capable work. The rest of the afternoon was spent performing smaller maintenance tasks around the pasture. Daniel repaired broken fence posts, checked the animals, and organized feed supplies. With each task completed, his confidence grew. He realized that competence wasn't just about physical strength or endurance. It was about awareness, planning, and careful action. Each success reinforced his belief that he could handle responsibility, that he could make decisions, and that he could contribute meaningfully to the ranch and its legacy. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a soft golden color, the sun hanging low over the horizon. Daniel took a moment to rest, sitting on a fallen log near the edge of the pasture. He looked across the fields, watching the cattle grazing peacefully, the wind moving through the tall grasses, and the river glinting in the fading sunlight. It was a scene of calm and beauty, a reminder of why he loved this life despite its challenges. He felt a quiet pride, not just in the work he had done today, but in the way he was learning to think, plan, and act independently. George walked over and stood beside him, silent for a few moments. Then he spoke, his voice softer than usual. "You're growing into your own man, Daniel. I see it. You're learning, thinking, and taking responsibility. That's what I wanted for you all along." The words struck Daniel deeply. His father's approval had always been tied to action, to visible proof of effort, and now he had received it in a way that felt genuine and personal. Daniel nodded, feeling emotion welling up inside him. He realized that this moment was more than just about fixing a water line or completing a day's work. It was about recognition, trust, and connection. He had spent years trying to live up to his father's expectations, and for the first time he felt that he was meeting them on his own terms, through his own effort, and with his own judgment. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, Daniel and George began walking back toward the farmhouse. The air was cooler now, and the sounds of the ranch had settled into a calm evening rhythm. Daniel felt a sense of accomplishment and relief. He had faced a challenge, worked through it thoughtfully, and earned a rare moment of recognition from the man he had long both feared and admired. That night, after the animals were settled and the barn was secured, Daniel sat by the fireplace, reflecting on the day. He thought about the water line, the repairs, and the careful planning that had gone into solving the problem. He thought about his father's words, his rare praise, and the sense of trust that had been extended to him. For the first time, he felt that he was not merely following orders or performing labor, but actively contributing to the ranch's future in a meaningful way. The quiet of the night allowed Daniel to think deeply about his own growth. He realized that life on the ranch, while demanding, had given him skills, resilience, and a sense of responsibility that few others his age possessed. He had learned to observe, analyze, and act. He had learned patience, perseverance, and the value of careful planning, and he had learned that recognition, even in small doses, was deeply meaningful. Not because it was lavish or dramatic, but because it represented trust, understanding, and connection. As he lay in bed that night, Daniel thought about the future. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more work to be done, and more lessons to learn. But he also knew that he was growing stronger, more capable, and more confident in himself. He felt ready to face whatever came next, whether it was another complex repair, a difficult decision, or the continued effort of building his own path on the ranch. Sleep came slowly, but it was deep and restorative. Daniel dreamed of fields bathed in sunlight, of rivers winding through green pastures, and of quiet moments with his father, moments of understanding, trust, and shared purpose. When he awoke the next morning, he felt a renewed sense of determination. The challenges of the ranch, the lessons from his father, and the responsibilities he had taken on were all shaping him into the man he wanted to become. And as he stepped out into the morning light, ready to face another day, he knew that he was moving closer to not only earning his father's trust, but also discovering his own strength, resilience, and purpose. The morning broke slowly over the ranch, the first light spilling across the fields like a soft golden blanket. Daniel rose with a sense of purpose, his mind focused on the tasks ahead. Today was special. Not because there was a single difficult job to complete, but because he felt, deep in his heart, that he had reached a turning point. He had spent weeks learning, observing, and growing under his father's watchful eye. And now it felt as though the balance between expectation and trust was shifting. Daniel dressed carefully, pulling on his worn boots and buttoning his shirt. The ranch had become more than just land or livestock to him. It was a living lesson in responsibility, patience, and understanding. He remembered the early days when every task seemed daunting, when his father's presence felt like a shadow too heavy to escape. But those days were behind him now. He had faced challenges, learned from mistakes, and earned recognition in ways that mattered deeply. Today, he was ready to step further into his own role, to show not just effort, but leadership. He went outside, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs. The wind carried the familiar sense of hay, soil, and animals, mingling with the faint aroma of breakfast cooking in the farmhouse. The cattle were grazing quietly, and the horses flicked their tails lazily in the morning sun. Daniel watched them for a moment, appreciating the simple rhythm of life around him. Each animal, each blade of grass, and each sunbeam was a reminder of the life he had chosen, and the responsibilities he now embraced. His father, George, was already at the barn, examining equipment and checking the animals with his usual precision. Daniel approached carefully, aware that their unspoken connection had grown stronger over the past weeks. George looked up, his eyes meeting Daniel's with a quiet acknowledgement that carried more meaning than words could convey. "Morning," he said simply. Daniel nodded, replying in kind. There was no need for grand gestures. Both men understood each other in ways that were subtle but profound. The first task of the day was to prepare the southern field for planting. Daniel had studied the layout, considered the irrigation lines, and planned the sequence of work the night before. This time, however, he would not merely follow instructions. He would take the lead. He felt a flutter of nerves at the responsibility, but it was accompanied by determination. He wanted to demonstrate that he could handle both the physical and the planning aspects of running the ranch. Daniel began by organizing tools and materials. He laid out hoses, rakes, and shovels, double-checking the irrigation system for leaks or clogs. Then he moved to the soil, testing its moisture, assessing its readiness for planting, and making careful notes. Every action was deliberate, every decision considered. He realized that leadership was not about rushing or showing off, but about careful observation, planning, and thoughtful execution. Hours passed as he worked through the tasks he had planned. The sun climbed higher, warming his back and making him sweat, but he welcomed the effort. Each step of progress was visible, water flowing steadily through the lines, soil prepared evenly, and tools neatly organized. Daniel felt a deep sense of satisfaction in seeing the tangible results of his planning and labor. It was a lesson he had learned gradually. Success was not about speed alone, but about precision, patience, and consistent effort. Around midday, George came to check on him. He watched silently as Daniel moved through the field, adjusting the irrigation lines, checking the soil, and ensuring everything was in order. There was a quiet pride in George's expression, subtle but unmistakable. He spoke only once, but it carried weight. "You've done well," he said. Daniel felt a rush of gratitude and relief. Recognition from his father had always been rare and understated, but it was meaningful precisely because it was sincere. The afternoon brought new challenges. One of the irrigation valves needed replacing, and a section of fence had started to sag under the weight of time and weather. Daniel approached each problem with careful thought. He remembered the lessons his father had taught him, not just about ranch work, but about resilience, problem-solving, and responsibility. He measured the fence posts, tightened the supports, and replaced the valve with steady hands. Each task required patience, focus, and sometimes creative thinking. By the end of the afternoon, he had repaired the fence, ensured the irrigation system was flowing perfectly, and organized the equipment neatly. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting warm golden light over the fields, Daniel stood back to survey the day's work. The field looked ready, orderly, and well-maintained. The animals were calm, grazing peacefully, and the ranch hummed with quiet life. He felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not because he had done everything perfectly, but because he had approached each challenge thoughtfully, learned from each step, and taken responsibility for the results. George approached, walking slowly across the field. He stopped beside Daniel, placing a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of affection and recognition.
"I see you've learned a lot," he said. "Not just about the work, but about thinking ahead, making decisions, and taking responsibility."
"That's the kind of man I wanted you to become." Daniel felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. His father's words were more meaningful than any praise or reward. They represented trust, understanding, and the acknowledgement that he was growing into his own person. As the two men walked back toward the farmhouse, the sky turned shades of pink and purple. The ranch seemed to glow in the fading light, alive with the quiet beauty of nature and hard work. Daniel realized that the challenges he had faced were not just about physical labor. They had been lessons in patience, resilience, and the importance of thinking ahead. He understood that leadership was about responsibility, decision-making, and care, not just doing what was asked. That evening, after the animals were settled and the barn was secured, Daniel and George sat on the porch. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the fireplace and the earthy aroma of the fields. They didn't speak much, but the silence was comfortable, filled with mutual understanding and respect. Daniel reflected on the journey he had taken. The early days of pressure and tension, the hard work, the small moments of recognition, and the gradual growth into a role of responsibility. For the first time, he felt that he and his father were more than just employer and worker, or father and son. They were partners in the life of the ranch, connected by shared effort, respect, and understanding. Daniel realized that the bond he had longed for, the recognition, the trust, the shared purpose, was now forming naturally. It wasn't about words or declarations, but about actions, trust, and the willingness to grow together. As night fell and the stars began to twinkle above, Daniel felt a quiet sense of peace. The ranch was thriving. The animals were cared for, and he had proven to himself and to his father that he could handle responsibility and make thoughtful decisions. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more hard work, and more lessons to learn. But he also knew that he was growing stronger, more capable and more confident every day. Before going to bed, Daniel took one last walk through the fields, the cool grass brushing against his boots. He paused by the river, watching the water glint in the moonlight. It was a moment of reflection, a moment to appreciate how far he had come. The path had not been easy, but it had taught him resilience, patience, and the value of thoughtful action. He felt ready for whatever the future held, knowing that he had the skills, the mindset, and the guidance to face it successfully. When he returned to the farmhouse, George was already in his study, reviewing notes and schedules for the next day. Daniel glanced at him and smiled, a small, genuine smile. George looked up briefly, returning the gesture with a nod. A simple acknowledgement, but one that carried warmth and approval. Daniel felt a sense of closure for the struggles he had faced, a recognition that the hard work and effort had led not only to competence, but also to understanding, connection, and growth. That night as he lay in bed, Daniel reflected on the journey of the past weeks. He thought about the challenges he had faced, the lessons he had learned, and the moments of recognition that had marked his progress. He understood that life on the ranch and in the world was a constant process of learning, adapting, and growing, and he felt a quiet confidence that he could meet each new day with patience, determination, and a thoughtful approach. The ranch was alive with the soft sounds of nighttime, wind in the trees, the occasional low of a cow, the rustle of animals settling for sleep. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling a sense of satisfaction and anticipation. He had faced challenges, learned from them, and earned his place not just as a worker on the ranch, but as a capable, thoughtful young man, ready to take on responsibility and growth. And as he drifted into sleep, he felt a profound sense of connection, not only to the land and the animals he cared for, but also to the Father who had guided him, challenged him, and ultimately helped him become the man he was meant to be.